The strange thing about birthdays is that you expect love. Even when your life has been cruel to you, even when people have disappointed you again and again, some small, foolish part of your heart still whispers, maybe today will be different. That was me standing at the front door of the house I grew up in, holding a small cake I bought with my own money, my hands shaking not from the cold, but from hope. I was turning 18 that day. No party. No friends invited. No gifts. All I wanted was one thing, to hear my mother say, "Happy birthday." Let me ask you something before I continue. Backhand index pointing right. Have you ever expected love from someone who had already shown you they wouldn't give it? Tell me in the comments, because this story begins right there. The clock on my phone read 6:43 p.m. when I knocked. I remember the time because it burned into my memory like a scar. When the door opened, it wasn't my mom's smile that greeted me. It was her eyes, cold, tired, already annoyed. "What do you want?" she asked. I swallowed. It's my birthday. She stared at me for a long second. Then she sighed, loudly, dramatically, like my existence itself was an inconvenience. So? That single word hurt more than I expected. I stepped inside anyway. The house smelled the same, cleaning spray and old resentment. The walls were still painted the same color. The family photos were still there, except I noticed something immediately. I was missing from most of them. My younger siblings smiled from frames on the wall. My stepfather stood proudly beside my mother. And me? Either cropped out or replaced. That should have been my first sign. I placed the cake on the table. "I bought this," I said quietly. "I thought maybe we could." She cut me off. "You're not staying here tonight." The words didn't register at first. "What?" I asked. "You heard me," she snapped. "You're grown now. 18. An adult. You want to act independent? Then be independent." My heart started racing. "I'm not asking for anything," I said. "Just, today. It's my birthday." That's when she said the sentence that changed my life forever. "I should have kicked you out years ago." Silence filled the room. Heavy. Suffocating. My stepfather didn't look up from the couch. My siblings stayed in their rooms. No one defended me. I remember laughing softly. Not because it was funny, but because sometimes pain is so unreal your body doesn't know how else to react. "So that's it?" I asked. "You're kicking me out, today?" She crossed her arms. "You've always been difficult. Always emotional. Always a burden." "A burden?" Let me ask you another question, and answer honestly. Backhand index pointing right. What do you do when the person who gave birth to you treats you like a mistake? I didn't cry. Not then. I went to my room, the small one at the back of the house. I packed my clothes into a backpack. Not a suitcase. Just a backpack. That's how little space I was allowed to take up in their life. Before leaving, I stood in the doorway one last time. "I hope one day," I said, "you remember this." She didn't respond. The door closed behind me. No hug. No apology. No "be safe." Just darkness, and the sound of my own footsteps walking away from the only home I had ever known. That night, I slept on a friend's couch. The cake melted in the bag beside me. I didn't eat a single slice, and that was the night I promised myself something. If I ever built a home of my own, no one would ever make me feel unwanted inside it. I had no idea how expensive that promise would become. Point 2 Survival doesn't care about feelings. That first morning after being kicked out, I woke up before everyone else. The house was quiet, not my house. Just a borrowed couch and a borrowed life. The ceiling fan above me clicked with every rotation, like it was counting down something I didn't yet understand. I stared at my phone. No missed calls. No messages. No "Are you okay?" No "Come back." It was then that something finally settled in my chest. They weren't angry. They weren't confused. They were relieved. Have you ever realized that your absence brings someone peace instead of pain? Backhand index pointing right. Tell me in the comments, what did that realization do to you? I slipped out quietly so I wouldn't wake my friend's parents. I didn't want to be another problem in someone else's home. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but the streets were already alive, cars passing, people heading to jobs, lives moving forward. Mine felt frozen. I checked my bank balance while standing at the bus stop. $184.37. That was it. No plan. No safety net. No family to fall back on, just me, and a backpack. I rode the bus to nowhere in particular. I didn't even know where I was going, I just needed movement. Sitting still made the fear louder. As the city passed by the window, I kept replaying my mother's words in my head. A burden. Difficult. I should have kicked you out years ago. Funny thing about words like that, they don't disappear. They settle into your bones. They change the way you walk, the way you breathe, the way you look at yourself in reflections. By noon, hunger became impossible to ignore. I walked into a small grocery store and bought the cheapest sandwich I could find. I ate it outside, sitting on the curb, watching people walk by without noticing me. That was my first lesson in adulthood. The world doesn't stop just because your heart is breaking. That afternoon, I started calling everyone I knew friends. Old classmates. Distant relatives. Most didn't answer. Some said sorry in voices that meant no. One aunt said, "You should apologize to your mother." I hung up without responding. Let me ask you something real quick. Backhand index pointing right. Why is it always the wounded one who's expected to apologize? By evening, reality hit harder. I couldn't couch surf forever. I needed money. Fast. I walked into a diner near the highway, greasy floors, cracked booths, the kind of place where people didn't ask many questions. Do you need help? I asked the manager. He looked at my backpack. You got experience? No, I said. But I'll work harder than anyone you have. He studied me for a moment. Then shrugged. Minimum wage. Night shifts. You start now. I nodded before he could change his mind. That night, I scrubbed tables while my hands shook from exhaustion. I spilled coffee on myself. Burned my fingers. Got yelled at by customers who couldn't even look me in the eye. But every time I wanted to quit, I remembered the door closing behind me. I remembered my birthday cake melting in a plastic bag, and I kept going. Weeks passed like that. Sleep. Work. Repeat. I rented a tiny room from an old woman who didn't ask about my past and didn't care about my future. As long as rent was paid on time, the walls were thin. The mattress was lumpy. The heater barely worked, but it was mine, and that mattered more than comfort. I learned how to survive quietly. I learned how to eat less without complaining. How to smile at customers while my feet screamed. How to nod when people said, "Family is everything." I stopped correcting them. Every paycheck felt like proof that I existed. That I was capable. That I wasn't what they said I was. Still, some nights were harder than others. On my 19th birthday, I sat alone in my room with a cup of instant noodles and no candles. I didn't tell anyone what day it was. I didn't want hope anymore. Hope had cost me too much, and just when I thought the pain had settled into something manageable, my phone buzzed. A message from my mother. Your mail came here. Come pick it up. No apology. No warmth. No, how are you? Just a reminder that she still had control over something that belonged to me. I stared at the screen for a long time. Should I go? Should I ignore it? Should I finally say everything I had swallowed? Backhand index pointing right. What would you have done? Comment below. I want to know. I didn't reply, and that silence, that was the beginning of something new, something stronger, something they never saw coming. Point 3. The long road to becoming untouchable. There's a phase in survival that no one talks about. It's not the hunger. It's not the loneliness. It's the moment you realize you're no longer waiting for anyone to save you. That realization didn't arrive loudly for me. It came quietly, disguised as exhaustion. I was 20 by then, still working nights at the diner. Still renting that tiny room. Still living a life so small it barely made noise, but something inside me had changed. I no longer checked my phone hoping for my mother's name to appear. I no longer replayed arguments in my head, wondering what I should have said differently. Instead, my thoughts were practical. How do I make more money? How do I leave this place? How do I make sure no one ever has the power to throw me away again? Let me pause here and ask you something important. Backhand index pointing right. Have you ever reached a point where pain stopped making you cry and started making you plan? Tell me in the comments, because that shift changes everything. I started picking up extra shifts. Then I found a second job, cleaning offices early in the morning before the city woke up. I slept 4 hours a night, sometimes less. My body ached constantly, but I welcomed the pain. It reminded me I was moving forward. Pain with direction feels different than pain with no purpose. At the diner, I started watching people, not judging, studying. I noticed who paid without checking prices. Who talked about investments like it was casual conversation. Who complained about jobs I would have killed to have. Point 1. Regular, a man in his 40s, always sat in the same booth. Clean clothes. Calm voice. Eyes that looked tired but sharp. Point 1. Night, after weeks of small talk, he asked me, "You ever think about doing more than this?" I didn't answer right away because the truth was, I thought about it every single day. "Yes," I said finally. "I just don't know how." He nodded like he understood more than I said. "You're not lazy," he replied. You're just surrounded by people who never taught you how to build. That sentence stayed with me. A few weeks later, he helped me get a job at a warehouse. It paid better. Harder work, but I didn't mind hard. Hard was familiar for the first time. I could save money, not much, but enough to feel hope again. Cautiously, carefully. I stopped telling people my story. I learned something important during that time. When you talk about your wounds too much, people start seeing you as fragile, even when you're not. So I became quiet. I let results speak. Years passed like that. I moved into a small apartment, nothing fancy, but it had walls that didn't listen. A door I could lock. A fridge I filled myself. I went back to school part-time. I learned skills no one in my family valued: budgeting, contracts, discipline. Meanwhile, my family existed only in the background of my life. Occasionally, I'd hear updates through relatives. She misses you. She doesn't understand why you're so distant. You know how your mother is. Funny how people always explain the behavior of the one who caused the damage, never the one who survived it. Let me ask you something blunt. Backhand index pointing right. Why do people expect victims to be more mature than those who hurt them? I never responded. Silence had become my boundary. By my late 20s, I was no longer struggling. I wasn't rich, but I was stable, and stability, when you've grown up disposable, feels like luxury. Then came the opportunity. A friend from work mentioned a property being sold cheap, an old house in a quiet neighborhood. It needed repairs. A lot of them. Most people said no. I said yes without fully understanding the risk, because something inside me needed that house, not just as shelter, but as proof that I could build something permanent. I worked on that house every spare hour I had. I painted walls at night, fixed leaks on weekends, learned through mistakes that cost me time and money. There were moments I wanted to quit, moments where I sat on the floor surrounded by tools, exhausted, wondering if I was pretending to be stronger than I really was. But every time doubt crept in, I remembered being told I was a burden, and I kept going. The day I moved in, I stood alone in the living room. No furniture yet. No decorations. Just empty space and quiet. I placed my hand against the wall and whispered, "No one can take you from me." That was the first night I slept without fear of being asked to leave, and that's when life did something unexpected. It tested me. My phone rang. A number I hadn't seen in years. My mother. I stared at the screen. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. I answered, "Hello?" Her voice sounded softer. Older. "I heard you bought a house." "No, how are you?" "No, I'm proud of you." "Just that." "Yes," I replied. A pause. "That's wonderful," she said. "Family should stick together. You know, we could all come over sometime." Family, that word landed differently now. Not warm, not comforting, heavy, possessive. Let me ask you, and answer honestly. Backhand index pointing right. What would you feel if the people who abandoned you suddenly remembered you when you had something worth taking? I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I just listened, and for the first time in my life, I realized I wasn't the powerless one in the conversation anymore. For when success rewrites old relationships, success doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't knock on doors or demand applause. Sometimes, it simply changes the way people speak to you. After my mother's call, I noticed it everywhere. Relatives who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly checked in. Old family friends asked for my address, just in case. Even my siblings, the same ones who stayed silent the night I was kicked out, started reacting to my posts online. I hadn't posted much. Just a photo of the house. Nothing dramatic, but apparently, it was enough. Let me ask you something before I go further. Backhand index pointing right. Why do people ignore your pain, but notice your progress instantly? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. At first, I kept my distance. I told myself they were just curious, that maybe time had softened everyone. Then came the visit request. My mother called again. This time, her tone was warm, practiced. "We were thinking," she said, "it's been so long. The family should get together." The family. Funny how that word returned only after I had something to offer. I agreed to a short visit, not because I owed them anything, but because part of me needed to see if I was strong enough now. They arrived on a Sunday afternoon. Cars filled the street. Laughter spilled out before they even reached the door. My mother walked in like she had never left my life. She touched the walls, the furniture, the counters. "This place has such good energy," she said. "I always said you had potential." I didn't correct her. I watched. My stepfather commented on the size of the house. My siblings wandered freely, opening doors, claiming rooms. "This would be perfect for family gatherings," one of them said casually. Perfect. No one mentioned the birthday. No one mentioned the backpack. No one mentioned the couch I slept on while they slept comfortably in the house I was thrown out of. It was as if my suffering was an awkward detail everyone silently agreed to skip. Dinner felt surreal. They sat at my table. Ate food I paid for. Smiled like guests who planned to stay. Then my mother said it. You know, she began, we've been struggling lately. I stayed quiet. The rent is getting higher, she continued. And with everything going on, it just makes sense for family to support each other. I looked up. Support? She leaned forward. This house is big. Too big for just one person. You wouldn't even notice us. There it was, not concern. Not reconciliation. A claim. Let me pause here and ask you something deeply personal. Backhand index pointing right. When someone who once discarded you tries to return, do they want you, or what you built? I set my fork down. I built this alone, I said calmly. Her smile tightened. And that's wonderful. But family shares. Shares. I remembered being told to leave with nothing. I remembered not being shared with, not food, not warmth, not protection. I took a breath. This house isn't family property, I said. It's mine. The room shifted. My stepfather cleared his throat. My siblings exchanged looks. My mother's voice hardened. So you're really going to turn your back on us? There it was again, the reversal. The victim becomes the villain. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain myself. I simply said, I'm not turning my back. I'm protecting what I built. Silence followed, thick. Uncomfortable. They left soon after. The hugs were stiff. The smiles forced. That night, I walked through every room of the house slowly. I realized something important. Success doesn't heal old wounds, it exposes who caused them. I wasn't angry. I was clear, and clarity is dangerous to people who rely on guilt. A few days later, the messages started. You've changed. Money made you cold. We never raised you to be like this. That last one almost made me laugh. Let me ask you, backhand index pointing right, can people raise you if they abandon you first? I didn't reply because some chapters of your life don't deserve footnotes, but deep down, I knew this wasn't over. People who feel entitled don't stop asking, they escalate. 5. When entitlement turns into accusation, people rarely react well. When they realize guilt no longer works. At first, they try softer words. Then reminders. Then history, and when none of that bends you, they change tactics. I felt the shift before I heard it. The calls stopped. The messages slowed. Then came the silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that feels like someone is planning something. A week passed, then 2. I started to relax again. I shouldn't have. One evening, as I was pulling into my driveway after work, I noticed a car parked across the street. Familiar, too familiar. My mother stepped out before I even turned off the engine. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. Her jaw was set. I got out slowly. What's going on? I asked. She crossed her arms, the same posture she used when I was a child and already in trouble. Before I even spoke, we need to talk, she said. Now. I didn't invite her inside. That alone offended her. We can talk here, I replied. Her eyes flicked toward the house. I spoke to a lawyer, she said suddenly. The words hit me harder than I expected. A lawyer? I repeated. Yes, she said, lifting her chin. About this house. My stomach tightened. Let me stop here and ask you something important. Backhand index pointing right. What would you feel if the person who once threw you away suddenly questioned your right to what you built? Comment honestly. Anger, fear, disbelief. She continued before I could respond. You lived here when you were a minor, she said. You benefited from family support. We sacrificed for you. I stared at her. Sacrificed. I remembered the nights I went to bed hungry. The birthdays forgotten. The door closing behind me. She took a step closer. That means, she said, you owe us. There it was, not love. Not regret, debt. I felt something inside me harden, not into hatred, but into certainty. You kicked me out, I said calmly. On my birthday. She scoffed. You exaggerate. Exaggerate? Let me ask you. Backhand index pointing right. Why do people minimize the pain they caused, but magnify the help they barely gave? Her voice grew sharper. This house wouldn't exist if it weren't for us, she said. You wouldn't be who you are without this family. I took a breath. You're right, I replied. I wouldn't. That caught her off guard. I'd probably be softer. More trusting. Less careful. Her eyes narrowed. I built this despite you, I continued. Not because of you. Silence, the kind that cracks something open. She shook her head slowly. I don't recognize you anymore. I almost smiled because that was the point. The next week, things escalated. I received a letter, not from her, from a legal office. They were inquiring about the ownership of the property, asking questions about financial history, suggesting that family contribution might complicate things. It was nonsense, but it was intimidating. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table staring at the paper. Old fear tried to crawl back in, the fear of being powerless. The fear of being erased, but this time, something was different. I wasn't a teenager with a backpack. I had records, receipts, contracts. I had proof, and for the first time, I also had something else. A voice. I hired my own lawyer. Best decision I ever made. He listened quietly as I told him everything: the eviction, the years of silence, the sudden interest. When I finished, he leaned back and said one sentence I'll never forget: they don't have a case. They have entitlement. Hearing that felt like air rushing back into my lungs. The legal response went out within days. Clear, firm, final. No shared ownership, no family claim, no leverage. After that, my phone exploded. Angry messages, crying voicemails, accusations wrapped in desperation. You're doing this to hurt us. You're breaking the family. You'll regret this. Let me ask you, backhand index pointing right, why is self-protection always labeled as cruelty when it inconveniences others? I didn't respond, not because I was scared, but because I was done explaining my existence. Weeks later, I heard through relatives that my mother was telling people I'd been brainwashed by money, that success had changed me. They were right. It had taught me that love without respect is just control. Wearing a smile and standing in my own home that night, I realized something heavy and freeing. They didn't want reconciliation, they wanted access, and when access was denied, they chose war. 6 When family turns the world against you, there's a special kind of pain that comes from being attacked by strangers over a story you lived, because you know the truth, but you also know the truth rarely travels as fast as a lie. I realized what was happening the day a coworker pulled me aside. I didn't know things were that bad between you and your family, she said gently. My chest tightened. What do you mean? She hesitated. I saw a post, your mother shared something. That night, I went home and opened my phone with a heaviness I hadn't felt in years. There it was. A long post, carefully written, emotionally loaded. She talked about sacrifice, about raising an ungrateful child, about being abandoned by her own flesh and blood. She didn't mention the birthday. She didn't mention the eviction. She didn't mention the years of silence. Instead, she painted herself as a mother who had been betrayed by success, and people believed her. Comments poured in: you did your best. Children forget where they come from. Money ruins families. Some even tagged me. That's when it hit hardest. Let me ask you something painful but honest. Backhand index pointing right. How do you defend yourself when the person hurting you controls the narrative? Relatives called, some angry, some concerned. Why are you doing this to her? She's heartbroken. Can't you just let it go? Let it go. As if trauma has an off switch. As if survival was a grudge. I tried explaining at first, just once. I told an aunt about being kicked out, about sleeping on couches, about building everything alone. She sighed. Well, parents make mistakes, but she's still your mother. That sentence ended something inside me, because I finally understood. They weren't listening to understand. They were listening to silence me. I stopped defending myself after that, not because I was wrong, but because I was done begging to be believed. Still, the damage spread. At work, people looked at me differently. In public, I felt watched, judged. The loneliness came back, heavier this time. Not the loneliness of having nothing, but the loneliness of having everything questioned. Some nights, I lay awake wondering if I should have just given them what they wanted: the house, the access, the control. Peace at the cost of myself. Let me ask you, backhand index pointing right, is peace real if it requires your self-erasure? That question changed everything. Instead of shrinking, I did something terrifying. I spoke, not online, not publicly, but directly. I wrote a letter, not to argue, not to accuse. To state facts. I sent it to the relatives who mattered. I explained the eviction, the timeline, the silence, the sudden entitlement. No emotion, just truth. Some never replied, some apologized quietly, and some revealed themselves completely. You should have been stronger. She's your mother. You're exaggerating. Those responses hurt, but they also clarified. I realized something powerful during that time: anyone who needs you to suffer quietly for their comfort does not deserve your presence. Slowly, the noise faded, the post stopped. The calls slowed, but the damage had already done something irreversible. It had burned the bridge completely, and standing there, watching the ashes fall, I felt something unexpected relief for the first time. No one could pretend anymore. No fake concern. No forced forgiveness, just reality. But life wasn't done testing me yet, because a few months later, I received a message that felt different, not angry. Not manipulative, desperate, from my youngest sibling. "I don't know who to believe anymore," they wrote. "But I remember that night. I remember you leaving." My hands shook as I read it, because this wasn't about property, this was about legacy and what story would survive when all the noise finally died down. 7. The conversation that changed everything. I stared at my sibling's message longer than I wanted to admit, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew whatever I said would matter. This wasn't about defending myself anymore. This was about truth surviving. I typed slowly. "You don't have to choose sides," I wrote. "I just need you to know what really happened." The reply came almost immediately. "Can we talk? In person?" My chest tightened because I knew what that meant. There was no version of this conversation that didn't reopen old wounds, but there was also no version where silence didn't let lies win. We agreed to meet at a small cafe halfway between our places, neutral ground, public, safe. When I arrived, they were already there, older now. Quieter. Carrying the same eyes I remembered from childhood, the ones that watched everything but said nothing. We sat across from each other in silence for a moment, then they spoke. "She cries a lot," they said. "She says you hate her." I took a breath. "I don't hate her," I replied. "I just stopped letting her hurt me." They looked down at their hands. "She says you were never grateful." That word again, grateful. Let me pause and ask you something deeply real. Backhand index pointing right. Why are survivors expected to be grateful for surviving what they never deserved? I didn't interrupt. I let them finish. "She says the house made you arrogant. That you forgot where you came from." I nodded slowly. "I remember exactly where I came from," I said. "That's why I protect what I have now." Then I told them everything, not emotionally. Not angrily, chronologically. The birthday. The eviction. The backpack. The couch. The years of silence, their eyes filled with tears halfway through. "I remember," they whispered. "I was in my room. I heard the door." That broke something open, because for the first time, I wasn't alone in the memory. "You didn't imagine it," I said gently. "You didn't misunderstand it. It happened." They wiped their face. "Why didn't you ever come back?" they asked. I answered honestly, because I was afraid if I did, I'd forget how hard it was to survive without them. Silence settled between us, heavy, but different now, not hostile, honest. After a moment, they asked the question I knew was coming. "Do you think she'll ever admit it?" I didn't answer right away, because some truths don't need hope. "No," I said finally. "I think admitting it would break the story she tells herself to survive." They nodded slowly. Then came the hardest part. "She wants to talk to you," they said. "Just once. Alone." My heart didn't race. It didn't ache. It steadied. I agreed, not for reconciliation, for closure. We met a week later. She sat across from me, older than I remembered. Smaller somehow. Her hands trembled slightly as she held her cup for the first time. She didn't control the space. "I don't understand why you hate me," she began. I didn't correct her. Instead, I said, "I want to talk about my 18th birthday." Her jaw tightened. "That again?" "Yes," I replied. "That moment changed everything." She sighed loudly. "You were difficult. Emotional. I was stressed." I nodded. "Maybe," I said. "But I was still your child." She looked away. "You embarrassed me," she said quietly. "You needed too much." Needed too much. Let me ask you something, and be honest with yourself. Backhand index pointing right. Since when did needing love become a crime? "I didn't need too much," I said calmly. "I needed a mother." That's when she cried, not loudly. Not dramatically, just tears slipping down silently. "I did my best," she whispered. I leaned back. "I believe you did what you could," I said. "But that doesn't mean it wasn't harmful." She looked up, startled. "You can't blame me forever." "I'm not blaming you," I replied. "I'm refusing to carry what was never mine." That was the moment she realized something had changed permanently. She couldn't guilt me. She couldn't scare me. She couldn't rewrite me. "What do you want from me?" she asked. The answer surprised even me. "Nothing," I said. "I just wanted you to hear the truth without being able to erase it." She nodded slowly. No apology came, and somehow, that was enough, because closure isn't always about healing together, sometimes it's about stopping the bleeding. When I walked out of that cafe, I didn't feel victory. I felt peace, not the fragile kind, the earned kind. Fire. End of chapter 7, cliffhanger. I thought that conversation was the end. I was wrong. Because peace doesn't stop consequences from arriving. Point 8. When the past loses its power, consequences don't always arrive with noise, sometimes they arrive quietly, in the form of distance that never closes again. After that last conversation, my mother didn't call, not the next day, not the next week, not even on my birthday, and for the first time in my life, that silence didn't hurt. It confirmed something I had already accepted. Some people don't want reconciliation. They want access, and once access is denied, they disappear. Life moved forward slowly. Steadily, the house stopped feeling like a symbol of survival and started feeling like a home. I filled it intentionally, not with people who shared my blood, but with those who respected my boundaries, friends who asked before entering, guests who didn't feel entitled to my space, laughter that didn't cost me dignity. I rebuilt more than walls. I rebuilt myself. Months later, I heard through my sibling that my mother told people she lost me. That word stuck with me. Lost. As if I were something misplaced, not someone pushed away, but I didn't correct the story, because here's the truth no one tells you: you don't need to be understood by those who never protected you. The real shift came one quiet evening. I was sitting in the living room, lights dim, rain tapping softly against the windows. The same kind of night that once filled me with anxiety, but this time I felt safe, and suddenly, I remembered that birthday, the cake, the door, the backpack. Only now, the memory felt distant, like a scar that no longer aches when it rains. That's when I realized something powerful. They kicked me out thinking I would fail. Instead, they freed me. They taught me the cost of conditional love. They showed me what I would never accept again, and without meaning to, they gave me the life they never thought I deserved. Years later, when they tried to claim my home as family, they weren't asking for shelter, they were asking for control, and this time, I said no, not angrily, not emotionally, just clearly, because clarity is something manipulators cannot survive. If you're listening to this story right now, I want to ask you something important, not for me, but for yourself. Backhand index pointing right. Have you ever been punished for growing beyond the people who hurt you? Backhand index pointing right. Have you ever been called selfish for choosing peace over guilt? Backhand index pointing right. And if the people who broke you came back today, would you open the door, or protect what you built? I didn't get an apology. I didn't get validation, but I got something far more valuable: freedom. And if this story taught me anything, it's this: family isn't who claims you when you succeed. Family is who stands with you when you have nothing. Everyone else is just history. Backhand index pointing down. Now it's your turn. Answer honestly in the comments. 1. Would you forgive someone who abandoned you, or would you choose distance? 2. 剑帽, do you believe blood is stronger than boundaries? Why? Or backhand index pointing down. Now it's your turn. Answer honestly in the comments. 1. Would you forgive someone who abandoned you, or would you choose distance? 2. 剑帽, do you believe blood is stronger than boundaries? Why or why not? Keycap 3. And if you built everything alone, would you let anyone claim it as family? Speech balloon. Comment your answer. Your story might help someone who's still standing at the door, holding a bag, wondering if they should leave. Red heart if this story resonated with you. Like, share, and subscribe, because stories like this remind us you are not cruel for protecting yourself. You are brave.